The day I inherited 1,000 acres of rural nothingness should have been uneventful, a dusty footnote in my otherwise predictable life. But the moment the lawyer handed me the yellowed map and whispered, "They don't know this land is yours," something sharp and electric flashed through me. It felt like the air thickened, bending around a secret that had been waiting decades to breathe. I unfolded the brittle paper right there in his office, and the moment my eyes found the borders of my new property, all 1,000 acres of it, I felt my pulse slam against my ribs, because plastered right across nearly half of that land was something I hadn't expected to see. An entire suburban community, an HOA, Oak Ridge Meadows, a place I knew far too well, the place that ruined my parents' lives. They built all of this on our land. I asked, though the answer was printed clearly in the crisp lines of the property survey. Not legally, the lawyer said, but they don't know that. And from what I can gather, no one has questioned the deeds from the 80s. Your grandfather never filed disputes because, well, you know how he was. Yeah, a man who hated conflict almost as much as he loved his land. The type to grumble quietly instead of raising hell publicly. But I wasn't my grandfather. And unlike him, I had scores to settle. As I stared at the map, the community pool, the tennis courts, the playground, and over 60 houses, all squatting on land they didn't own, a slow, dangerous calm settled into me. My childhood came back in bitter flashes. My parents working 2 jobs each. The sudden HOA compliance fees that bled them dry. The fines for our appealing mailbox. For the unsightly truck my father needed for work. For the tiny vegetable garden my mother grew to save grocery money. The endless harassment disguised behind polite emails and signed notices. The day they finally lost the house. The day everything fell apart. All because of the HOA president and her pack of smug enforcers. Because they wanted uniform aesthetics. Because they wanted order. Because they wanted to feel powerful. Now their entire neighborhood, every last cookie-cutter house and picture-perfect lawn, was sitting illegally on my land. My land. It was like fate had finally cracked its knuckles and handed me a gift wrapped in overdue karmic justice. I traced the northern border of the acreage with my finger. The line cut through manicured backyards like a blade. Something wicked curled inside me. They're going to lose everything, I whispered to myself, a vow forming as sharp as broken glass. The lawyer cleared his throat. You have several legal options, of course. You could sell to them, negotiate terms, file to reclaim. Reclaim, I said quietly, with certainty. He blinked. That's the most aggressive route. Good. For the first time in my life, I felt something close to satisfaction. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel nervous. I felt ready. Let them be shocked. Let them scramble. Let them try to defend themselves with the same arrogance they used to destroy my family. They had no idea what was coming. Driving out to see the land didn't feel real, at least not until I turned down the winding road that I used to bike on as a kid. The air tasted the same. Pine, dusty gravel, and the faint sweetness of wild honeysuckle. But everything else had changed. Oak Ridge Meadows was in the modest neighborhood I remembered. It had grown into a full-blown community with a monument sign, manicured shrubs, and those ridiculous stone pillars designed to make it seem exclusive. The HOA must have quadrupled its budget over the years. I pulled over beside the sign, my hands gripping the steering wheel. That cold, coiled feeling in my chest tightened. A black SUV rolled past and slowed just enough for the driver, a tan woman with oversized sunglasses, to give me the standard HOA you don't belong here glare. How fitting. Soon none of them would belong here. I drove around the perimeter first, studying the boundaries. Then I parked at the far end and took out the old map. The lines intersected dozens of homes, living rooms, patio decks, yard with trampolines and swing sets. Most of that land should never have been touched. They had built an empire on a foundation of stolen date. As I walked the property, the question that had been festering all morning returned. Why didn't anyone check the land deeds properly when they built this? How did they think they were entitled to land that was never theirs? It wasn't just arrogance. It was negligence. It was greed. It was the same entitlement that had destroyed my parents. The sun was sinking when I reached the old boundary stake, one of the original markers my grandfather had hammered into the earth himself. It leaned slightly now, weathered and rusted, but it still stood, still holding the line for me. "Oh," I murmured. Above the tree line, laughter drifted from a backyard nearby. Kids playing, adults chatting, clinking glasses. Their perfect little world was about to crack. I pulled out my phone and snapped photos, documenting everything. Not because I needed evidence, but because I wanted to remember this moment, the moment before the storm. As I walked back to my truck, a teenage boy biking down the sidewalk stared openly at me. "You lost?" he asked. "No," I said, sliding my keys into the ignition. "Just getting reacquainted with what's mine." He squinted. "Your house here or something?" "Something like that." I drove off before he could ask more questions. But the real question, the one that mattered, the one curling like smoke in my chest, was, how would they react when they learned that their homes, their lawns, their playgrounds, their HOA all belonged to me now? Would they fight? Would they beg? Would they try to intimidate me like they did my parents? Or would they crumble under the weight of their own hypocrisy? I didn't know yet, but I did know one thing. Whatever they chose, I was ready. And this time, I was the one with the power. The next morning, I woke with a clarity that felt almost unnatural, too sharp, too focused, like my mind had been grinding gears all night while I slept. I brewed coffee, sat at the small kitchen table of my tiny rental, and laid out everything I had: the map, the inheritance documents, copies of the survey, and the lawyer's notes. The HOA of Oak Ridge Meadows had no idea that their entire kingdom was built on land they had never legally owned. They had operated for years with smug authority, barking orders and enforcing rules, never imagining that the very ground they walked on could be pulled out from under them. It was poetic, and, if I played my cards right, devastating. I took a slow sip of coffee and looked at the map again. The bold boundary lines were more vivid in the daylight, almost smug in their accuracy. Every cul-de-sac, every street lamp, every overpriced home, all of it sitting on territory that legally belonged to me. But the goal wasn't to bulldoze them in a single day. Not yet. Revenge, real revenge, requires patience, precision, and a kind of quiet coldness that can't be rushed. I wanted them to feel it, to feel the cracks forming before they realized the whole structure was collapsing. The first strike had to be subtle, a tremor before the earthquake. I met with my lawyer at 10. A closed-door meeting, his blinds angled so the sun cut across the room in thin, sharp lines. "I thought about what you said." I began, "about the options." He nodded slowly, steepling his fingers. "And I don't want to sell. And I don't want to negotiate." I leaned forward. "I want to assert full ownership. And I want to start now." He didn't look surprised, just resigned. "Then the first step is a formal notice of land claim. It has to go to the HOA board and the developer." "Developer's long gone," I said. "Sold the company years ago." "Which makes the HOA responsible for any encroachment issues." He paused. "They aren't going to take this well." "That's the idea." A flicker of amusement softened his expression. "You're very different from your grandfather." "I know. And you understand what this means? Once we file the notice, they will become aware of the situation. They may deny it. They may attempt to stall. They may push back aggressively." "Good." He nodded and reached for his pen. "We'll draft the claim." As he scribbled legal jargon, I stared at the certificate of inheritance on his desk. My grandfather's name was right above mine. For so long, that name had meant something gentle: quiet mornings, fishing, the smell of firewood on his flannel shirts. But now, that inherited legacy felt like steel armor. He had protected the land. Now I would use it. By noon, the paperwork was ready. The formal claim of land ownership was drafted, notarized, and packaged neatly inside an envelope thick with consequences. My lawyer asked if I wanted him to send it via courier. "No," I said, sliding it off his desk and tucking it under my arm. "I'll deliver it myself." "You're sure?" "That's bold." I want to see their faces when the first domino tips. The drive back to Oak Ridge Meadows felt different this time. Yesterday, I was just absorbing the details, studying the borders. Today, I was coming for them. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always had. Perfect lawns, power-washed sidewalks, and that shallow shine of artificial peace. Everything sterile, controlled, and suffocating. I parked near the community clubhouse. The building looked more like a boutique spa. Arched windows, trimmed shrubs, a stone walkway arranged with geometric precision. My fingers tightened around the envelope. Inside, I found exactly what I expected. 2 board members seated at a round table, laptops open, papers neatly stacked, and expressions as self-important as ever. One was a man in his 50s with a comb-over that defied physics. The other was a woman with a stiff bob haircut and a cardigan that screamed HOA authority. "Can we help you?" she asked, lowering her glasses as though I would track dirt on her carpet. "Yes," I said, stepping forward. "I need to speak with the board." The man looked annoyed. "The board meets on the first Tuesday of every month. You'll need to submit concern for agenda approval beforehand." I set the envelope on the table. "This concern doesn't need approval." The woman's lips tightened. "What is this?" "A land claim. Effective immediately." The man snorted. "A what?" "Open the envelope." She hesitated, then slid a manicured nail under the flap and pulled out the documents. Her eyes scanned the first page, then widened. This can't be correct," she whispered. "Oh, it's correct," I said, my tone pleasantly calm. "Your entire HOA is on private property. My property." The man grabbed the papers, flipping through them with growing panic. "This must be a mistake." "No mistake," I said. "You're occupying land that doesn't belong to you, and that means your HOA, your amenities, your structures, and a large number of your homes are standing illegally." They stared at me as if I'd just announced the son was being repossessed. The woman finally found her voice. "You can't just walk in here and—" "I'm not asking." I cut in. "I'm informing. You'll receive a full legal notice by the end of the day." Their stunned silence was sweeter than any dessert I'd ever tasted. I turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Oh, and one more thing," I added, glancing back. "You'll want to call an emergency meeting, because trust me, everything's about to change." The woman stood abruptly. "You don't understand what you're doing." I smiled. "No," I said. "You don't." Then I stepped outside, letting the door swing shut behind me. As I walked back to my truck, something warmed in my chest. Not joy, not triumph, but something deeper. A shift. A turning of gears that had been rusted shut for years. I could already imagine the chain reaction happening behind me. Phone calls, panic, denial, meetings, spreadsheets, fear creeping in like smoke. For decades, they had treated people like me, people like my parents, as problems to be handled, nuisances to be corrected, non-compliance to be punished. Now they were the ones out of compliance. Now they were the ones vulnerable. I climbed into my truck and exhaled slowly, steadying myself. This was just the beginning, the first ripple. The real wave was still coming, and when it hit, it would tear through everything they'd built. As I started the engine, my phone buzzed with a text from my lawyer. "They are already calling. Brace yourself. The board wants an urgent meeting." I smirked. Good. Let them scramble. Let them sweat. The land had waited long enough. By the time I pulled into the gravel drive of the old farmhouse I was using as a temporary base, the HOA board had already blown up my phone with 4 missed calls, 2 voicemails, and an email marked urgent, response required. I didn't open any of it. Let them simmer. Instead, I made myself lunch, sat on the porch overlooking the rolling acres that now belonged solely to me, and waited. Revenge wasn't only about striking, it was about timing, and fear thrives best in silence. Only when the sun began to dip behind the trees did I finally check my lawyer's message. HOA has scheduled an emergency meeting at 7 p.m. tonight. They are demanding your presence. Demanding? Of course they were. I arrived 10 minutes early. Oak Ridge Meadows looked different this time, like the shine had already begun to dull. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe not. Fear is a way of making even well-manicured places feel crooked. Cars packed the parking lot of the community clubhouse. You would think it was a holiday event, not an emergency meeting that threatened their very existence. Homeowners clustered in nervous groups near the entrance, whispering, clutching papers, frowning at their phones. And every single pair of eyes followed me as I walked toward the door. A woman in yoga pants and a designer sweater tightened her grip on her water bottle. A man with a shaved head narrowed his eyes. People stepped aside instinctively, as though I were carrying something contagious. Maybe I was. Truth. Inside the clubhouse, the noise grew. Voices layered on top of each other. Panic, anger, denial. At the front of the room sat the 5 HOA board members behind a long table. Their faces were stone masks trying very hard to hide cracks. The president sat in the middle, Margaret Tanner, the woman who had tormented my family for years. Her hair was shorter now, silver streaks blending with blonde, and she'd aged. But her eyes, those icy blue eyes that once scanned my parents' house with disapproval, they hadn't changed a bit. She stared at me as I approached, recognition flickering. Good. Let her remember. A gavel slammed down. Order, she barked, though her voice trembled ever so slightly. We will now begin this emergency session of the Oak Ridge Meadows Homeowners Association. I folded my arms, waiting. Margaret adjusted her glasses. We are here because, according to certain allegations, a portion of Oak Ridge Meadows may be built over land without clear title. She forced a tight smile. Mr. Cole Brennan. A ripple went through the room. Some people whispering, some frowning, someone muttering who. But Margaret froze. Her jaw tightened. She knew exactly who I was. Mr. Brennan, she said carefully, has delivered documents claiming ownership of the land our community is built on. He asserts that the deeds obtained by the original developer were incomplete or invalid. Not asserts, I corrected. Proves. A few gasps. Someone in the back cursed under their breath. A board member with a comb-over, Greg, leaned forward, jabbing a finger toward me. This is absurd. There's no way the entire neighborhood is on your property. Not the entire neighborhood, I said calmly. Only about 60% of it, including the clubhouse we're currently standing in, the pool, the tennis courts, and a large number of homes. The room erupted. People stood. Voices rose. Someone yelled, "This guy's lying." Another shouted, "My house better not be on the list." Someone else said, "What does this mean? Are we trespassing?" Margaret slammed the gavel again. Order! Order! But the panic was raw and uncontrollable now. I let it simmer for a moment before speaking again. The land was never transferred legally, I explained, projecting my voice. My grandfather owned it. He passed it to me. Nobody ever obtained proper rights to build here. Not the developer. Not the HOA. Not any of you. A young mother near the front clutched her toddler's hand. Are you going to make us leave? She asked, eyes wide with fear. I let the question hang. Silence rippled. Then I answered, I'm here to reclaim what's mine. The room exploded again. Margaret stood, her face red. This is blackmail. No, I said coldly. Blackmail is when you use threats to get something you don't own. This is me taking back something that was stolen. You can't just take people's homes, she snapped. Funny, I said, leaning slightly toward her, because that's exactly what you did to my family. Her breath hitched. She remembered. She remembered the late fees, the fines, the harassment, the foreclosure. Cole Brennan, she whispered. I didn't realize. Didn't realize. My voice sharpened. Or didn't care. More whispers surged behind me. Brennan? Didn't they used to live here? Wasn't there some messy situation years back? Didn't the HOA force a sale? Margaret tried to recover her composure. This isn't personal. It's a legal matter. No, I said softly. It's both. The lawyer hired by the HOA, some slick man in an overpriced suit, stood up. Mr. Brennan, surely you understand that this will go to court. We will challenge your claim. You can try, I replied, but the paperwork is airtight, and the law is very clear about land encroachment. Margaret's voice cracked, betraying fear she could no longer hide. What is it you want? I considered her carefully. I could have demanded immediate evacuation. I could have demanded back pay for years of illegal land use. I could have given them a deadline that would shatter their lives overnight. But no, that would be mercy. I wanted them to feel every step of the fall. What I wanted was control. Here's what I want, I said, letting my voice drop into a slow, deliberate calm. Effective immediately, I'm filing a cease and desist order on any HOA enforcement actions. No more fines. No more citations. No more penalties. Every rule, every policy, every regulation you pushed onto these homeowners, all frozen. Indefinitely. The room went still. Homeowners looked around, stunned, confused, but hopeful. The board members blanched. If I couldn't tear the HOA down in one night, I could gut it from the inside. You're putting the HOA on pause, someone asked. Yes, I said. Consider it step one. Greg sputtered. You can't dismantle our authority. It's my land, I replied. Authority starts with ownership, and you don't own a single square inch of what this HOA sits on. Margaret swallowed hard. And what is step two? I smiled. I'll tell you when we get there. She sank back into her chair, stunned. I turned toward the crowd. I suggest you all go home. There will be more updates soon. And with that, I walked out, not because a meeting was over, but because I said it was. Behind me, chaos erupted again, but I didn't look back. The power dynamic had shifted, and I had only just begun. By morning, the HOA's panic had ripened into full-blown hysteria. I didn't even need to drive through Oak Ridge Meadows to know it. The notifications told me everything. Word had spread faster than wildfire on dry brush. My inbox was a battlefield of desperate questions, legal threats, and messages dripping with a mix of fear and entitlement. But one stood out above the rest. A message from Margaret Tanner herself. We need to talk. Privately. Urgent. I smiled at the screen. She was unraveling faster than I expected. Before responding, I stepped onto the porch of the farmhouse. The morning air was sharp and cool, the sky a washed-out blue. Below me, the fields stretched endlessly, acres of land that had outlasted my grandfather, survived developers, and now stood as the backbone of a reckoning long overdue. I sipped my coffee slowly. Let her wait. After 20 minutes, I texted back. 2 p.m. At the clubhouse. And you're coming alone. I arrived early again, not to be punctual, but to see the chaos firsthand. Predictably, a swarm of homeowners had clustered across the lawn, not allowed inside but buzzing like a hive of angry bees. Arguments erupted in pockets. A man shouted into his phone about property values. A woman cried, "We just put in a new patio. What happens now?" A jogger in neon shorts yelled at a board member, "Do something. That's what we pay you for." The HOA's kingdom wasn't collapsing quietly. It was crumbling in full spectacle. I walked past them, phones lifting to record me. Someone hissed, "That's him." Another muttered, "What a bastard." A third whispered, "Honestly, good." They needed to be taken down a peg. Interesting. Not everyone here worshipped the HOA. Inside the clubhouse, silence greeted me. Margaret sat at the far end of the long table, hands clasped tightly together. A stack of folders sat beside her, documents, records, and doubtless a frantic attempt to find leverage. She looked smaller today. Not physically, just diminished. The armor she once wore, that arrogant executive confidence, was cracked clean through. "Cole," she said quietly. I closed the door behind me and took a seat opposite her. "Margaret." She exhaled shakily. "I never expected to see you again." "I know," I said. "That was the point." A tense silence grew between us. She opened one of the folders but didn't push it toward me. "You have to understand," she began, "when your family lived here." "Stop." My voice cut through the room. "You're not going to rewrite history." Her lips tightened. "I was only doing my job." "Your job was to maintain the neighborhood," I said coldly, "not to harass hard-working people until they lost their home." She flinched. "Good. She should feel something." You fined my parents for a mailbox color that was too faded. $10 a day, I said. You fined my dad for parking his work truck in the driveway. You fined my mother for planting tomatoes because it didn't meet aesthetic standards. You fined them until they couldn't breathe. Her voice was barely a whisper. I didn't realize the impact. You never cared to. Her eyes glistened, but whether from regret or fear, I couldn't tell. Maybe it didn't matter. She straightened slightly, trying to gather what remained of her dignity. Cole, I know we had our history, but what you're doing now, it's affecting hundreds of innocent people. Please, there must be another way. I leaned back in my chair. I offered another way. I said, yesterday, when I froze all HOA enforcement. That was step 1. And step 2, she asked, voice trembling. Step 2 is cleaning house. Starting with you. Her breath caught. You want me to resign? No, I said calmly. I want the entire board to resign. Her eyes widened. That's unreasonable. No, I replied. Unreasonable was charging residents $75 because their grass was half an inch too long. Cole, please. Unreasonable was forcing a single mother to repaint her driveway because a shade of gray was too cool-toned. I didn't. Unreasonable was telling my mom her garden was a nuisance. The word tasted acidic in my mouth. Margaret's voice finally broke. I thought I was doing what was best for the community. The community doesn't think so, I said. Talk to the people outside. Listen to what they are saying. The HOA isn't protecting them. It's choking them. I leaned forward, letting the full weight of my stare pin her in place. The board resigns, I said, and I'll consider negotiating terms. She swallowed hard. And if we refuse? I shrugged. Then I proceed with the full land reclamation. You'll lose everything. The amenities go first, since the structure sits squarely on my property. Then the rec fields, the walking paths, the park. People depend on those. They should have depended on a competent board that actually checked land titles. She buried her face in her hands. Oh my God! I waited, letting her sit in the reality she had helped create. After a long, trembling breath, she finally asked a question she'd been avoiding. What do you actually want, Cole? What is your endgame? I thought about it, really thought about it. The rage had always been clear. The need for justice, obvious. But the plan, the real plan, was something bigger. I want control, I said quietly. I want the HOA out. Completely. Permanently. Her head snapped up. You want to dissolve the HOA? Yes, I said. And once it's gone, I'll replace it with something better. Something fair. Something that doesn't punish people for living their lives. But you're one man. You can't run a whole community alone. I don't plan to, I said. I plan to give it back to the homeowners. All of them. Real community governance. Transparent rules. No more fines. No more power trips. She stared at me like I had grown another head. Why would you do that? After everything. Because they deserve better than what you gave them. And because my family deserved better, too. Silence sank thickly into the room. Finally, Margaret exhaled, shoulders slumping. I don't know if the board will agree. They will, I said, when you tell them the alternative is losing the lawsuit. And their homes. Her eyes flickered with resignation. She understood. The board was done. She was done. I stood to leave, but paused at the door. You have 48 hours to announce your resignations, I said. After that, we moved to step 3. She didn't ask what step 3 was. She didn't want to know. And as I walked out of the clubhouse, past the crowd, past the fear, past the beginnings of change, I felt the shift again, that click of a larger plan taking shape. The foundation had cracked. The walls were wobbling. Next, I would bring the whole house down. 48 hours. I figured they'd drag their feet, delay, try to negotiate, maybe even attempt some underhanded legal maneuvering. HOAs were predictable like that. Power never slips quietly from the hands of people who believe they were born holding it. But I underestimated just how swiftly panic erodes a kingdom built on fear. The resignations came in 26 hours, not as a coordinated announcement, not as a collected statement from responsible leaders. No, this was a free-fall. The treasurer quit first, posting a shaky Facebook video at 6 in the morning with puffy eyes and frantic breathing, claiming she was just trying to help a community and had no idea about the land issues. She insisted she couldn't be held personally liable. She begged for calm. It didn't work. Comments shredded her to ribbons. The vice president resigned through email only an hour later. The secretary followed at noon. And Margaret, she didn't resign publicly. She sent a private message to me at 12:47 p.m. You win. The board has agreed to dissolve. I stared at those words for a long moment. This wasn't the end, but it was the moment the old regime died. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt vindicated. But all I felt was steady, like a machine finally ticking into the next gear, cold, certain, unstoppable. By evening, I drove down the familiar curve of Oak Ridge Meadows again. Except this time, the manicured perfection looked hollow. Houses that once stood polished and proud now seemed small, fragile, like miniature replicas waiting for an earthquake. And it was coming. A crowd gathered at the park, if you could still call it the park. Soon enough, it would be a field again, the swing set removed, the ground leveled, the structures reclaimed. But for now, it hosted a neighborhood meeting unlike any they'd ever seen. No board, no gavel, no rules, just residents. And me. As I stepped into the center of the open space, chatter died like someone had hit a mute button. Some faces were nervous, some defiant, some quietly relieved. I scanned the crowd. No Margaret. Good. She wasn't ready for this. I raised my voice. Thank you all for coming. A man with a baseball cap shouted. We didn't have much choice. I shrugged. Free will is always an option, but I'm glad you used yours wisely. Ripples of nervous laughter. A woman holding a toddler asked, Is it true? The whole board quit. Yes, I said simply. Effective immediately, the HOA as you know it no longer exists. Gasps. A few cheers. One guy clapped aggressively, earning dirty looks from his neighbors. I continued, You're probably wondering what comes next. A teenager called out, Yeah, dude, are you kicking us out or what? No, I said, letting the word land slow and heavy. I'm not here to evict anyone. That was their style, not mine. A wave of visible relief swept through the group. But, I added, I'm reclaiming my land, and we're going to rebuild this community correctly. A middle-aged man snorted. Rebuild? With what money? With who running things? With you, I said. All of you. Now confusion replaced fear. I took a breath. This was a moment that mattered, the pivot between vengeance and reconstruction. And I needed them to see the plan as more than retaliation. My family lost everything because of an abuse of power, I said. You know it. Some of you heard about it then. Some of you pretended not to. Some of you were too young to understand. But now? Now you all get to live the consequences of what happens when decision-making is centralized in the hands of people who were never elected, never questioned, and never held accountable. Heads nodded, even the stubborn ones. I continued, So here's how this is going to work. The crowd held its breath. I'm dissolving the HOA charter. Legally, permanently. There will be no reinstatement, no new board, no shadow committee. The baseball cap guy yelled, Hell yes. Someone else muttered, Finally. But not everyone looked thrilled. A few residents exchanged worried glances. What about standards? A woman asked. Or maintenance? The landscaping? The pool? We can't just have chaos. You're right, I said, which is why we're rebuilding governance. From zero. A real democratic association. Optional membership. Transparent use of funds. No fines. No arbitrary punishments. And absolutely no authority without accountability. Whispers filled the air. This was new. Radical, even. So, I said, projecting my voice, we're starting with temporary committees. Volunteer-based. No one gets paid. No one gets power unless the community votes for it. You'll elect spokespersons. You'll decide the rules. You'll decide how the shared spaces work. But you own all the land, someone pointed out. Doesn't that make you, well, dictator? Fair question. I own the land, I said. But I don't want to own the community. I want fair oversight. I want practical rules, not oppressive ones. And most importantly, I let the silence grow thick. I want justice for what was done here. No one spoke, not even a whisper. I'm going to require temporary access agreements for all homes built illegally on my land, I said. Not for control, for documentation, for clarity, and yes, eventually for renegotiated property lines. Panic flickered again. So, are we safe? A woman whispered. Yes, I said, but you're not exempt from change. This community will look different when I'm done. Fewer restrictions, more transparency, more freedom, and for the first time in decades, actual legal footing. I paused, and if any of you are afraid I'll turn into another Margaret Tanner, don't be. Someone shouted from the back, Then what are you, exactly? I looked across the sea of faces, fearful, hopeful, angry, uncertain. Then I said, I'm the one who's going to fix what they broke. A murmur rippled through the crowd, quiet approval, quiet fear, quiet awe. But before anyone could ask the next question, movement caught my eye. A figure standing alone at the edge of the park. Margaret, her face pale, hands shaking, watching everything she built crumble, piece by piece, brick by brick. Good. She needed to see it. She needed to witness the fall. Because her part of this wasn't done yet. Not even close. I gave the crowd final instructions. I'll be sending out detailed steps, forms, and updates within the week. Until then, no one panic, no one move, and no one try anything stupid. This is a beginning, not the end. And with that, I stepped away, heading toward my truck through the murmuring crowd. As I passed Margaret, she whispered, Cole, please, don't take everything. I didn't stop walking. I didn't even look at her. I just said, You haven't lost everything yet, but you will. And I meant it, because step 3, it was going to be brutal. The days that followed were a blur of letters, surveys, and legal filings. Oak Ridge Meadows had entered a new reality. The HOA was gone, the board dissolved, and the residents were left to reckon with what that really meant. And I watched from my vantage point over the 1,000 acres, orchestrating each step, letting chaos and clarity coexist until the structure of control I despised so deeply fully crumbled. Margaret Tanner disappeared almost entirely from the neighborhood. Rumor had it she moved out to live with her sister, but I suspected she was still watching, still measuring my moves, still terrified. Good. She needed to see what happens when a community built on intimidation and greed is confronted with its own truths. The first challenge was documentation. Every house, every road, every clubhouse structure had to be surveyed and legally confirmed against my land titles. It was tedious, grueling work, but every acre validated my claim and strengthened the residents' newfound freedom. The contrast was stark. For decades, their lives had been micromanaged by a board that exploited technicalities to control everything, and now the rules were being rewritten transparently, one legal foot at a time. Some residents resisted initially. Old habits die hard, and fear lingered like a stubborn stain. They feared I might turn vengeful, or that the dissolution of the HOA meant total chaos. They called for meetings, petitions, even private negotiations, but I was unwavering. Step 3. The final wave wasn't about punishment. It was about exposure and accountability. And then came the house audits. The legal notices went out. Residents occupying land without formal agreements now had 30 days to enter into a temporary license agreement. The reaction was immediate. Some were terrified, some furious, but every single one had to reckon with reality. The streets were alive with whispered conversations. Cole Brennan owns this land. We're living on illegal property. Do we pay him more? The tension was exquisite. It was the same tension my parents had felt decades ago, but this time I controlled the narrative. They feared me because I was competent. They feared me because I had patience. And above all, They feared me because they knew I had every right to stand where I did. A week in, a man named Curtis approached me at the edge of my property. He was a board member's former assistant, now just a concerned resident. He said cautiously, "Cole, I know what you're doing. But why? You've got the land, the power. Why bother with the community?" I looked at him carefully, letting my words sink. Because I don't want revenge that destroys innocence. I want accountability. My family lost a home because people like the previous board thought rules were more important than lives. I'm not here to hurt anyone beyond what's necessary to make them face the truth. He frowned. "So, what's the end game?" "The end game," I said slowly, "is justice and clarity. Everyone here will know exactly what's theirs, what's mine, and how to live without arbitrary oppression." Curtis nodded slowly, though he still looked uneasy. "And Margaret?" "She'll have to face her own conscience," I said, and the knowledge that her actions were fully exposed. The final move came 2 weeks later. Step 3, full public disclosure. I held a neighborhood assembly open to all residents, and projected maps on the wall showing exact property boundaries, legal titles, and the structures built without authorization. Each plot of land I marked with precision, each house accounted for. Gasps filled the room. Murmurs turned into exclamations. Some residents were furious, some relieved, and some finally understood why my parents had suffered. "This is your land," I said to the room, "and these structures are on it. You have agreements to sign for temporary access. This is not optional. But from here on, the rules change. You have a chance to self-govern, with fairness, with accountability, and without fear." Margaret Tanner's name hung in the air without mention, but everyone knew. She had been the architect of decades of control and fear, and now the system she built had vanished. The room was quiet. No one dared speak her name aloud. It was poetic. The residents began organizing themselves. Committees for parks, maintenance, security, and communal spaces emerged. I did not take a leadership role, only oversight. I wasn't there to rule. I was there to ensure justice, and that it stuck. And finally, the last piece, Margaret. She called that evening, her voice trembling. "Cole, don't. I interrupted. There's nothing left for you here. Your power is gone. Your authority is gone. The people you tried to control now have their freedom." I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't think." "You didn't think," I said quietly, the sharpest part of my voice cutting through. "And that's why you lost everything. Remember, Margaret, fear is a weapon, but when it turns on its wielder, there's nowhere to hide." There was silence on the line. I let it stretch, long enough to let the weight of years sink in. "Goodbye," I said, and ended the call. By the end of the month, Oak Ridge Meadows was unrecognizable. Gone were the oppressive bylaws. Gone were arbitrary fines. Gone were the board members who had tormented my family. In their place, a community cautiously optimistic, slowly taking responsibility for the land they lived on, and for the neighbors they shared it with. And me? I finally stood atop the hill behind the old farmhouse, surveying the entirety of my inherited 1,000 acres. Every corner, every boundary, every acre now stood as a monument not just to ownership, but to justice. The wind carried the sound of children laughing, dogs barking, sprinklers spraying across green lawns. It was peaceful, but not in the controlled, suffocating way of the HOA. It was real. It was earned. It was free. And I allowed myself a small, private smile. Revenge had been sweet. Justice had been sweeter. And for the first time in decades, my family's name, the Brennan name, stood not as a victim, but as a guardian of fairness and truth. As the sun dipped below the horizon, golden light stretching across my acres, I whispered to no one in particular. Some debts take generations to repay, but when the reckoning comes, it is inevitable. And on that land, my land, justice had finally come home,